Some betrayals come with a knife. Mine came with a quiet bank notification at 2:14 a.m. The freezing winter wind was howling relentlessly against the frosted window panes of the house, rattling the wooden frames I had spent 40 years maintaining. But inside my darkened study, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, a half-empty mug of black coffee sitting on the coaster next to me, having long gone bitterly cold. The harsh, sterile blue light from my laptop screen cut through the pitch-black room, illuminating the deep, weathered wrinkles on my face and casting long shadows over my heavily calloused hands. Hands that had spent decades acting as the silent, load-bearing structures for this family. I was staring at a digital ledger, my eyes locked on a single line item that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. $340,000. Gone. This wasn't just a number on a glowing screen. It was a physical manifestation of my life's blood, the entirety of a retirement fund, painstakingly scraped together, penny by penny, skid vacation by skipped vacation, to ensure my wife could receive top-tier, round-the-clock care for her rapidly advancing dementia. The transfer destination was staring back at me, mocking my lifetime of quiet sacrifice. It was an account linked directly to my only biological son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy whose private education I had worked double shifts to pay for, had just stripped his own mother of her future. But the absolute most infuriating part, the part that made my jaw clench until my teeth physically ached in the silence of the night, was the calculated, cold-blooded cruelty of his method. To completely bypass the bank's strict IT security protocols and fraud alerts, he hadn't just stolen my passwords. He had digitally forged his own mother's signature, weaponizing her fading memory against her. In the transaction notes, he had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to label the massive withdrawal as specialized neurological treatment in Switzerland. He had used her devastating illness as a convenient, unbreakable smokescreen to fund his own unfathomable greed. For a fraction of a second, the primal urge to rage flared up inside my chest. I wanted to throw my cold coffee mug against the wall, to drive over to his apartment, drag him out of bed, and scream until my lungs gave out. But I am a man who has spent a lifetime understanding systems, compliance, and unbreakable structures. I took a slow, deep breath in the dark and let the fiery anger metabolize into something much more dangerous. Colder, not louder. Done, not angry. I realized in that moment that revenge is loud, but true justice, the kind of justice that permanently shifts the foundation of someone's life, is completely quiet. Before I tell you exactly how this perfect legal trap snapped shut on him right at the center of our Thanksgiving dinner table, do us one quick favor. Hit that subscribe button. It helps us share more stories of structural boundaries, the harsh reality of family betrayal, and the heavy weight of natural consequences. I didn't make a single panicked phone call. I didn't scream into the night. I simply closed my laptop with a soft, definitive click. I pushed my chair back, the old wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet, and walked slowly up the stairs. The hallway was completely dark, but I knew every step by heart. I walked into our bedroom and stood by the door for a long moment, watching my wife sleep peacefully, her chest rising and falling steadily in the quiet room. She looked so fragile, completely unaware that the son she had once rocked to sleep had just sold her survival for his own vanity. I walked over to her side of the bed, gently pulled the heavy quilt up over her frail shoulders to keep the winter chill away, and stood there in the profound silence. My son thought he was dealing with an exhausted, oblivious old man who would just roll over, accept defeat, and let him win. He had absolutely no idea. I sat back in the deep leather of my chair, the stifling silence of the house pressing against my ears, and slowly looked away from the glaring laptop screen down to my own hands. They are rough, deeply lined, and permanently scarred. A physical map of 40 years of relentless, silent labor. Throughout my career as an IT compliance specialist, I was paid to build impenetrable firewalls, to reinforce failing systems, and to act as the ultimate safeguard against corporate collapse. But my true life's work, The responsibility that consumed every waking second of my existence was being the silent, load-bearing wall for this family. I was the patriarch who absorbed the heavy, crushing blows of the world so my wife and son wouldn't have to. For over 2 decades, I woke up long before the sun, breathing in the freezing Wisconsin air, and climbed into a rust-bitten, rattling truck that constantly smelled of old engine oil and damp upholstery. I drove that miserable machine long after the heater permanently died, shivering through brutal, bone-chilling winter commutes, simply because taking on a new car payment would mean less money for my son's future. While my colleagues took their families to warm beaches and bought expensive dinners, I sat at our faded laminate kitchen table, eating cheap, heavily salted canned soup and cold sandwiches, methodically transferring every single spare dollar into an educational fund. I did it willingly, without a single complaint or demand for gratitude. I did it so Marcus could walk the polished, mahogany-paneled halls of an elite private academy, completely surrounded by privilege. I wanted to give him a life where he never had to feel the suffocating weight of poverty. I built a massive financial fortress around him, brick by agonizing brick, to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. But sitting here in the dark, the horrifying truth finally crystallized. By ensuring he never felt the burden of survival, I had inadvertently raised a boy who fundamentally despised the very foundation he was standing on. The sheer, calculated arrogance of my son didn't just materialize overnight with this theft. It was a slow creeping, toxic rot that I had willfully ignored until the night of his engagement dinner, just a few short weeks ago. I remember standing near the edge of a dimly lit, overwhelmingly expensive restaurant patio, deliberately keeping to myself and nursing a simple glass of ice water. Marcus was a few feet away, holding court with his new circle of high society, trust fund friends. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, casually swirling a glass of imported scotch. Suddenly, I heard my name. I stepped back into the shadows of the ivy trellis and listened as my own flesh and blood turned my entire lifetime of sacrifice into a cheap, arrogant punchline for his wealthy audience. He pointed his glass vaguely in my direction, laughing as he called me a worn-out survivor. He told his sycophantic friends that my frugality, my refusal to buy luxury goods, and my quiet endurance weren't signs of love or paternal discipline, but rather the pathetic weakness of an older generation that simply didn't know how to truly live. He looked at my heavily calloused, grease-stained hands, the very hands that had quite literally paved the golden road he was currently walking on, and sneered, dismissing me as an outdated relic in front of people who had never worked a hard day in their lives. The nauseating contrast of that moment hit me harder now than it did then. There he was, a man with perfectly manicured, soft hands who had never even changed a tire in the freezing rain, openly mocking the stoic resilience of the father who had funded his entire illusion of grandeur. He viewed my quiet nature not as strength, but as a lack of ambition. He genuinely believed that the structural boundaries I had lived by were just the pathetic quirks of a tired, broken old man. He looked at the load-bearing structures of our family and saw nothing but an obstacle to his inheritance, a bank vault waiting to be carelessly looted as I sat alone in my study, the memory of his arrogant, mocking laughter echoing in my mind alongside the reality of the $340,000 he had just stolen from his dying mother. The very last remnants of my paternal leniency evaporated into the freezing night air. My profound sadness hardened into something completely unbreakable. Done, not angry. Colder, not louder. He thought I was just a passive, oblivious ATM waiting to be drained until I died. He thought my silence was submission. He had absolutely no idea. And as any seasoned IT architect knows, when an arrogant user disrespects and tries to tear out a load-bearing wall, the entire hollow, delusional structure they built above it is destined to collapse into absolute dust. I didn't reach for my phone to call the police right away. That would have been the frantic, emotional reaction of a man who was out of control, a man who needed to make noise to feel powerful. But I was operating on a completely different frequency now. I was done, not angry. My son, in his infinite, arrogant delusion, thought he had committed the perfect digital crime because he assumed I was just a tired, obsolete old man who barely understood how to navigate the modern world. He had absolutely no idea. He forgot, or perhaps his blinding greed made him completely ignore the fact that I am a man who spent 4 decades as a top-tier IT compliance specialist, explicitly trained to track hidden financial anomalies and build impenetrable digital structures. I didn't need to yell, and I certainly didn't need to resort to cheap physical violence to get answers. I just needed my encrypted laptop, a fresh pot of bitter black coffee, and the absolute chilling silence of the Wisconsin winter night. I cracked my knuckles, the joints popping loudly in the empty study, and opened a secure command terminal on my machine. Colder, not louder. That was the mantra playing on a relentless loop in my head as my scarred, calloused fingers began to fly across the keyboard. I didn't just look at the superficial bank statements. I initiated a quiet, comprehensive forensic audit of every single digital footprint he had left behind. Marcus was sloppy. He had routed the stolen $340, zero through two hastily constructed offshore shell accounts, foolishly thinking that geographic distance and a few dummy LLCs would mask his trail. But digital money always leaves a scent if you know exactly which lines of code to dissect. I bypassed his amateur routing numbers, decrypted the timestamp logs, and methodically followed the lifeblood of my wife's medical fund as it bled directly into his personal, unsecured accounts. What I uncovered over the next 3 hours didn't just make me physically sick. It fundamentally destroyed the last remaining shred of paternal leniency I held for the boy I had raised. The $340,000, the exact, painstakingly calculated amount required to secure a specialized memory care facility for his mother's rapidly advancing dementia, wasn't locked away in some misguided high-yield investment. Within 48 hours of the fraudulent transfer, Marcus had completely liquidated massive chunks of it. I pulled up the vendor receipts, the IP addresses, and the wire transfer confirmations. My wife's neurological care, her dignity, and her very survival had been callously traded for a custom-ordered, high-performance luxury sports car. I sat in the dark, staring at the digital invoice for a brand-new, matte black Porsche 911, complete with upgraded leather interiors, but his sickening vanity didn't stop there. Further down the ledger, another massive wire transfer was sent directly to a high-end boutique jeweler in downtown Chicago. He had purchased a flawless 3-carat diamond engagement ring for his new mistress, a calculating woman who had been whispering in his ear for months, encouraging his toxic entitlement. He had quite literally stripped the medical safety net from his own dying mother so he could rev the engine of a German sports car and put a blinding rock on the finger of a gold digger. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my cold, tearless eyes. I felt a profound, icy calm settle over my soul. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a complete severing of the familial bond. I was no longer dealing with a son. I was dealing with a parasite who had tried to completely hollow out the load-bearing structures of this family for his own amusement. I systematically compiled every IP address, every forged digital signature, and every unarguable piece of financial evidence into a secure, encrypted master file. The snare was meticulously set. Revenge is loud, justice is quiet. And the structural legal retribution I was about to unleash upon him was going to be completely deafening. Just 2 days after I completed the quiet, devastating digital audit of his financial crimes, the biting Wisconsin winter delivered him right to my front doorstep. I was sitting in my usual armchair by the frosted living room window, a fresh, steaming mug of black coffee in my hand when I heard it. It wasn't the heavy, honest rumble of a combustion engine. It was the high-pitched, arrogant, and nearly silent hum of a brand-new, matte black Tesla Model S Plaid crunching over the ice driveway. I watched through the glass as Marcus stepped out of the vehicle he had purchased with his mother's survival fund. He was wearing a tailored cashmere overcoat and a designer scarf, looking every bit the successful, self-made man he desperately pretended to be. He reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a small, insulated paper bag. When he walked through the front door, he immediately launched into the sickening performance of a lifetime. He was playing the role of the dutiful, deeply concerned son to absolute perfection. He walked into the living room, flashed me a bright, rehearsed smile, and held up the bag. Inside was a container of warm chicken soup from an expensive organic deli downtown. He actually had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to use a $15 bowl of soup as a theatrical prop to mask a $340,000 theft. I watched in absolute silence as he walked over to my wife, his mother, who was sitting in her wheelchair near the fireplace, wrapped in her heavy quilt. Her dementia was particularly bad that morning. She looked at him with vacant, confused eyes, having no idea who this well-dressed stranger in her living room was. Marcus knelt down, holding her frail hand, and softly spoon-fed her a bite of the warm soup, making sure to look over his shoulder to see if I was witnessing his profound act of familial devotion. The hypocrisy of the moment was so thick, so intensely toxic, that it physically suffocated the air in the room. He was spoon-feeding the very woman whose lifeblood he had just drained to buy a German sports car and a 3-carat diamond ring. I didn't throw my coffee at him. I didn't stand up, grab him by the collar of his expensive coat, and demand to know how he could be so monstrous. Colder, not louder. I just sat there, taking a slow, measured sip of my bitter coffee, letting the dark liquid burn the back of my throat. I am a man who builds load-bearing structures, and I knew that if I showed even a crack of emotion, the foundation of my trap would weaken. After his little performance, Marcus patted his mother's hand, stood up, and walked over to the sofa opposite my chair. He unbuttoned his coat, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees, putting on a mask of deep manufactured solemnity. "Dad," he started, his voice dripping with fake empathy. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about you and Mom. I know how hard this is getting for you." I kept my eyes locked on his, my face a completely unreadable slab of stone. "Is that right?" I said quietly. "Yeah," he sighed, running a hand with a perfectly manicured nail through his hair. "I worry about you, Dad. The medical bills, the upkeep of this big house, it's too much for one guy." I was looking at the real estate market. "It's incredibly hot right now. Have you ever considered selling this place?" I didn't blink. I let the silence stretch out, accompanied only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Marcus took my silence as an invitation to keep digging his own grave. "Listen, Dad, I want to help you optimize your finances," he said, actually using the word optimize to describe stripping me of my home. "If we sell this house, we can free up a lot of liquid capital. We can move Mom into one of those state-run, budget-friendly care facilities. They do great work, really, and you could get a small apartment. I could take over managing the assets for you, make sure the money grows. You wouldn't have to stress anymore." The sheer magnitude of his greed was almost mathematically impossible to comprehend. It wasn't enough that he had stolen her private, top-tier medical fund. It wasn't enough that he had robbed my retirement. Now, sitting in the warmth of the home I had built for him, he wanted to strip the very roof from over my head, push his dying mother into a crowded, underfunded public facility, and take control of whatever pennies I had left to fuel his high society illusion. He wanted to completely demolish the last remaining load-bearing walls of this family, simply because they were in the way of his vanity. I looked at his expensive watch, I looked at his soft hands, and then I looked straight into his eyes. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he was playing a tired, obsolete old man who would simply sign over the deed to the house out of sheer exhaustion. I took another slow sip of my coffee. He had absolutely no idea. He didn't know about the decrypted digital audit sitting on my hard drive. He didn't know about the appointments I had already scheduled. He didn't know that every single word he was saying was simply a shovel, digging his financial and legal grave a little bit deeper. I didn't raise my voice. I simply offered him a faint, chilling smile and said the quietest, most terrifying words a father can say to a parasitic child. "I'll take it under advisement, Marcus. I'm making a few structural changes this week." He smiled back, completely oblivious, believing he had just won the ultimate prize. But as he drove away in his stolen Tesla, leaving me in the quiet winter afternoon, I knew exactly what was coming. Because revenge is loud, but justice is completely quiet. The morning after my son drove away in his stolen luxury car, playing the role of the dutiful child, I didn't wake up and start making frantic, emotional phone calls. I didn't drive over to his expensive new apartment to bang on his door, demand my money back, or engage in a loud, pointless screaming match. I am a man who has spent his entire adult life analyzing and building load-bearing structures, and I know that when a foundation is completely, fundamentally compromised, you don't try to patch it with anger. You systematically demolish it with cold precision. My mindset was completely locked in. I was done, not angry. I put on my heavy winter coat, started my old, rusted truck, and drove through the freezing Wisconsin sleet toward the downtown financial district. My first stop was not the local police precinct, but the quiet, mahogany-paneled office of William Vance, a seasoned estate and wealth management attorney I had known for over 2 decades. William took one look at my face, poured 2 cups of strong black coffee, and quietly closed his heavy office door. "What is it, Arthur?" he asked, sitting across from me. I didn't waste time with tears or dramatic, sorrowful monologues. I slid a thick manila folder across his desk, containing the decrypted digital audit I had meticulously compiled the night before, along with the forged digital medical signatures Marcus had used to drain his mother's $340,000 dementia care fund. I watched William's professional, stoic composure slip for a fraction of a second as his eyes scanned the bottom line. "He used her illness to bypass the bank's fraud alerts," I said, my voice as flat and cold as the concrete sidewalks outside. "I need to establish absolute structural boundaries today, William. I want every single remaining asset, the house, the life insurance policies, the antique cars, and my pension. Moved immediately. Moved where?" William asked, already pulling out a fresh legal pad. "Into an irrevocable trust," I replied, invoking the ultimate, unbreakable legal weapon. "I want it structured so tightly that not even a team of high-priced corporate lawyers could crack it in 100 years. I want the sole beneficiary to be the Alzheimer's Research Foundation, named in my wife's honor. Marcus is to be completely and permanently disinherited. He gets absolutely nothing. Not a penny, not a photograph, not a single square inch of the house he just arrogantly told me to sell." William nodded slowly, fully understanding the sheer gravity of what I was doing. When a father signs an irrevocable trust to cut out his only biological son, it isn't a temporary punishment or an empty threat. It is a permanent structural execution. It was the ultimate form of quiet, cold financial retribution. I sat there and signed my name in blue ink across 7 different pages, feeling the heavy, suffocating burden of blind paternal obligation finally lift from my shoulders. But legally disinheriting him was only the defensive perimeter of the snare. I still needed to trigger the offensive strike. From William's office, I drove directly to the federal building to meet with an investigator from the Economic Crimes Task Force. I didn't walk in off the street like a panicked, helpless victim. I walked in as a fellow compliance professional. I sat in a sterile, windowless interview room and handed Special Agent Harris an encrypted flash drive. It contained the exact IP addresses, the time-stamped offshore wire transfers, the dealership invoice for the Tesla Plaid, and the luxury boutique receipt for the 3-carat diamond ring. I had essentially gift-wrapped a federal wire fraud and elder abuse case with a neat, undeniable digital bow. Agent Harris scrolled through the data on his secure terminal, letting out a low, impressed whistle. "He wasn't very smart about hiding this money," Harris muttered, clicking through the forged documents. "He didn't think he needed to be," I replied coldly, taking a sip of the terrible lobby coffee. "He thought he was stealing from a tired, obsolete old man who wouldn't know how to fight back." Working directly with the federal authorities, we quietly initiated the final, most devastating phase of the trap. We didn't send a squad car to Marcus's penthouse to tip him off or give him a chance to run. Instead, Agent Harris submitted the irrefutable evidence to a federal judge, to quietly authorize a total asset freeze. At that exact moment, every single bank account linked to my son's social security number, including the offshore shell accounts he thought were so cleverly hidden, was instantly and silently locked down by the federal government. As I drove back home through the falling snow, the heater in my truck barely working, I felt a profound, unwavering sense of calm. I had just dismantled my son's entire existence without raising my voice a single decibel. Colder, not louder. Somewhere across town, Marcus was probably driving his new sports car, adjusting his expensive cashmere scarf and grinning at his own twisted cleverness. He thought he had outsmarted the world. He had absolutely no idea. He had no idea that his credit cards were now utterly worthless pieces of plastic. His inheritance was legally vaporized, and the federal snare was already pulled tight around his neck, just waiting for the perfect moment to snap. The weekend of our family Thanksgiving gathering arrived, bringing with it a bitter, blinding Wisconsin blizzard that perfectly mirrored the absolute coldness in my chest. This was the moment of the slow burn tension, the heavy, suffocating calm before the storm that I had meticulously engineered. I was sitting quietly at the head of the long oak dining table, a glass of ice water in my hand, listening to the arrogant, high-pitched hum of Marcus's stolen Tesla pulling up to the house. When the front door swung open, a gust of freezing wind blew into the hallway, followed immediately by my son and his new fiancée, Chloe. They walked into my home acting not like family, but like visiting royalty gracing a peasant's tavern with their presence. They were both dressed in absurdly expensive, custom-tailored designer winterwear, radiating a sickening aura of unearned superiority and condescension. I remained in my seat, my face an unreadable mask of stone, employing the exact philosophy that had governed my entire life. Colder, not louder. I didn't confront them. I didn't ruin the dinner with cheap, emotional yelling or physical violence. I simply watched, allowing the audience of my own mind to savor the agonizing, delicious anticipation of the trap that was already tightly coiled around their ankles. Marcus helped Chloe take off her fur-lined coat, revealing a silk dress that cost more than my first truck. But it was her left hand that caught all the light in the room. Sitting heavily on her finger was the flawless 3-carat diamond engagement ring. Every time she moved her hand, the blinding sparkle of the gemstone practically screamed through the room. I looked at that ring, and I didn't see a symbol of love. I saw the exact monetary value of my wife's neurological treatments. I saw the $340,000 that had been drained from the load-bearing structures of this family. The absolute peak of their nauseating charade happened in the living room, right before the turkey was carved. My wife was sitting in her wheelchair, a soft knitted blanket draped over her fragile legs, her eyes clouded with the heavy fog of her dementia. Chloe walked over to her with a wide, fake, heavily painted smile.
Hi, Mom.
Chloe chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. We brought you a little something for the holidays. Chloe reached into her designer leather handbag and pulled out a small plastic bottle of hand lotion. It still had the neon orange clearance sticker attached to the bottom, a heavily discounted $3 drugstore item. She carelessly dropped the cheap plastic bottle into my wife's trembling hands, making an exaggerated, theatrical gesture so the massive diamond ring on her finger flashed directly in my wife's confused face. She was literally waving the stolen, high-end luxury of my wife's medical fund right in front of her eyes, while simultaneously insulting her with a piece of clearance rack trash. It was an act of cruelty so profoundly deep that it would have broken a lesser man. For a fraction of a second, the primal urge to stand up, grab that 3-carat ring and throw both of them out into the freezing blizzard flared in my chest, but I instantly buried it. Done, not angry. I knew that revenge is loud, but true. Structural justice is completely quiet. I just sat there, taking a slow sip of my water, feeling the icy liquid ground me. We moved to the dining table. Marcus took his seat, immediately pouring himself a glass of an incredibly rare, $200 vintage red wine he had brought to show off. He sat back, swirling the dark liquid in his glass, and began to hold court. He talked loudly and arrogantly about his newly optimized investment portfolio, his plans for the downtown penthouse, and how his financial genius was finally paying off. He looked at me with a patronizing smirk, offering me unsolicited advice on how I needed to liquidate my assets and let him manage the family estate because I was clearly too old to understand the modern market. He was completely drunk on his own illusion of victory. He was sitting at the table of the father, whose life he had ruined, wearing clothes bought with the blood of the mother sitting right next to him, boasting about a financial empire that was literally built on a foundation of felony wire fraud and elder abuse. I looked at him over the rim of my water glass. I didn't say a word. I just let the silence stretch, amplified by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. He thought he was a mastermind. He thought he was untouchable. He assumed that the digital theft was a ghost in the machine that I could never trace. He had absolutely no idea. He had no idea that his offshore accounts were already frozen, that the irrevocable trust had already stripped him of every penny of his inheritance, and that his entire reality was currently resting on a legal tripwire that was less than 10 minutes away from snapping. The tension in the room was a physical weight, a slow-burning fuse crawling steadily toward a massive keg of dynamite, and I was the only one who could see the spark. The dining room was thick with the suffocating, sickening sound of my son's arrogant laughter, completely drowning out the howling Wisconsin blizzard outside. Marcus had just raised his glass of $200 vintage wine, preparing to deliver yet another boastful toast to his own fabricated financial genius, fully believing he had successfully hollowed out the load-bearing structures of our family without consequence. He looked at me across the table with that patronizing smirk, his custom-tailored suit a glaring testament to the $340,000 he had drained from his mother's dementia care fund. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pulling tighter and tighter with every passing second. And then it finally snapped. It wasn't a doorbell. It was three heavy, sharp, unapologetically authoritative knocks on the solid oak of the front door. The sound cut through Marcus's smug monologue like a physical blade. He paused, his wine glass hovering halfway to his mouth, an annoyed expression crossing his face. "Are you expecting someone, Dad?" he sighed, clearly irritated that his grand performance had been interrupted. I didn't answer. I didn't even blink. I just sat perfectly still in my chair at the head of the table, gently swirling the ice water in my glass. Colder, not louder. I took a slow sip and simply nodded toward the hallway. Marcus huffed, set his expensive wine down, and marched to the front door, fully prepared to yell at whoever was standing on the porch. But when he yanked the door open, the arrogant words died instantly in his throat. Standing there in the freezing sleet, their heavy winter coats dusted with snow, were Special Agent Harris and two uniformed federal officers from the Economic Crimes Task Force. They didn't wait for an invitation. They stepped out of the biting cold and directly into the warm hallway, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor with terrifying finality. "Marcus Pendleton?" Agent Harris asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes?" Marcus stammered, the color rapidly draining from his face as his eyes darted from the badges on their belts to the grim expressions on their faces. "What is this? Who are you?" "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Economic Crimes Division," Harris stated smoothly, pulling a thick stack of folded documents from his jacket. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of felony wire fraud, identity theft, and severe elder financial abuse." The absolute silence that fell over the house in that moment provided the most profound, intoxicating sense of vicarious catharsis I had ever experienced. The smug, untouchable illusion Marcus had worn just 10 seconds ago shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He stumbled backward, his manicured hands trembling. This is a mistake," he yelled, his voice cracking with sudden, raw panic. "I haven't done anything. I'm an investment manager. You have the wrong person." "There's no mistake, Mr. Pendleton," Agent Harris replied coldly, stepping directly into the dining room. "We have a fully decrypted digital audit. We have the forged electronic medical signatures. We have the exact IP logs from your laptop and the offshore routing numbers you used to transfer $340,000 from your mother's specialized medical trust into your personal accounts. Marcus gasped, looking like a man who had just had the air violently sucked from his lungs. His eyes slowly moved away from the federal agents and locked onto me. I was still sitting at the head of the table, my hands resting calmly on the polished wood. I didn't yell. I didn't stand up to physically threaten him. I just looked at him with the cold, immovable gaze of a father who had officially severed the bond. "Dad," Marcus whispered, his voice shaking with absolute horror as the realization finally hit him. "Dad, you gave them the audit. You used your mother's fading mind to bypass a bank firewall, Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it echoed like thunder in the silent room. "You thought I was just a tired old man who didn't understand systems. You had absolutely no idea who you were stealing from." Before Marcus could even process the magnitude of his destruction, Agent Harris turned his attention to Chloe, who was sitting frozen in her chair, clutching her designer handbag. "Ma'am," Harris said, pointing a stern finger at her left hand. "The 3-carat diamond ring you are currently wearing was purchased with funds directly linked to this federal wire fraud. It is classified as stolen property and material evidence. Take it off and place it on the table. Now." Chloe's eyes widened in sheer terror. She looked at Marcus, who was now completely hyperventilating as one of the uniformed officers began reading him his Miranda rights. The illusion of his immense wealth and high society status vanished instantly. Chloe didn't hesitate. Without a single word of comfort for the man she was supposed to marry, she practically ripped the blinding diamond ring off her finger and slammed it onto the oak table. "I didn't know," she shrieked, backing away from him as if he were carrying the plague. "He told me he made a killing in the market. He's a liar. I have nothing to do with him." She grabbed her fur coat and ran out the front door, abandoning him to the federal authorities and the freezing blizzard without looking back even once. "We'll also be taking the keys to the Tesla Model S parked in the driveway," Harris continued, utterly unfazed by the dramatic exit. "The vehicle is being seized under federal asset forfeiture laws." Marcus was sobbing now, a pathetic, loud, messy display of a broken man realizing that his entire life had just been legally and financially demolished. The officers pulled his arms firmly behind his back, the sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoing through the dining room. It was the sound of ultimate structural justice. As they began to march him toward the door, Marcus dragged his feet, turning his tear-streaked face toward me in a desperate final plea. "Dad, please, do something. Help me," he screamed, abandoning every ounce of his previous arrogance. I didn't move. I simply picked up my glass of ice water, taking one final, deliberate sip. I looked directly into the eyes of the boy I had sacrificed my entire life for, the boy who had tried to leave us with nothing, and delivered the final, undeniable truth of the world he had just crashed into. "Revenge is loud, Marcus," I said quietly, the gravel in my voice cutting through his hysterical sobbing. "Justice is quiet." 3 days after the Thanksgiving dinner, the biting Wisconsin blizzard had finally passed, leaving behind a neighborhood blanketed in pristine, undisturbed white snow. Inside my home, the atmosphere had returned to a profound, unbreakable silence. It was the kind of deep, healing quiet that only comes when a diseased, rotting branch has finally been cleanly and permanently severed from the family tree. I was sitting in my study, the harsh blue light of the laptop long gone, replaced by the warm, amber glow of a small reading lamp on my oak desk. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, measuring out the peaceful seconds. Then, the sudden, sharp ring of the landline shattered the calm. I looked at the caller ID. It was an automated collect call from the county correctional facility. I picked up the receiver and accepted the charges. "Dad? Dad, are you there?" The voice on the other end of the line was completely unrecognizable. Gone was the arrogant, high society investment manager in a custom cashmere overcoat. Gone was the man who had confidently sneered at my calloused hands and mocked my frugality in front of his wealthy friends. In his place was a terrified, hyperventilating, sobbing boy who was finally being crushed by the immense, unforgiving weight of natural consequences. "I'm here, Marcus," I replied, my voice as flat, heavy, and unyielding as a slab of granite. "Dad, please, you have to help me," he wept, the sheer panic vibrating through the phone line. "It's freezing in here. They took my suit. They won't let me make any other calls. Chloe won't answer her phone, and her lawyer sent me a cease and desist email. You have to post my bail. Please, Dad. I'll do anything. I'll sell the car. I'll pay it all back with interest. I'm your son. Family is family." I listened to his frantic pleading, feeling absolutely no urge to raise my voice, hurl insults, or lecture him on his morality. I was operating purely on the unbreakable principle of being done, not angry. "Family is family, Marcus," I said quietly, the gravelly tone of my voice leaving zero room for negotiation or emotional manipulation. "But healthy families require structural boundaries to survive. You didn't just steal money. You stole the literal lifeblood of your mother's survival to buy a German sports car and a diamond ring for a woman who abandoned you the second your stolen wealth evaporated. You weaponized your own mother's fading mind, forging her digital signature to bypass a bank firewall. You tried to completely demolish the load-bearing walls of this house to fund your pathetic vanity. I made a mistake. I was stupid," he screamed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of his holding cell. "Just wire the bail money, please." "There is no bail money coming from me," I stated coldly, delivering the ultimate form of quiet, structural financial retribution. "The federal task force has successfully seized the remainder of the stolen funds. Furthermore, my pension, the house, and all recovered assets have been fully transferred into an irrevocable trust, completely out of your reach forever. You have been legally and permanently disinherited. You are facing federal wire fraud and elder abuse charges entirely on your own," he gasped, a wet, choking sound, as the absolute finality of the situation finally pierced through his lifelong delusion of entitlement. "Dad, you can't just leave me here," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "How am I supposed to survive? What am I supposed to do?" I took a slow, deep breath, looking out the frosted window at the cold winter night, feeling the heavy burden of blind paternal obligation finally lift from my shoulders. "You wanted to live like you never had a father, Marcus," I said softly. "Figure it out like one." I hung up the phone. I didn't slam it down in a fit of rage. It was just a quiet, definitive click that permanently closed the chapter on his toxic existence in my life. The following weeks brought a deep, restorative peace to our home, providing the ultimate emotional validation for my lifelong sacrifices. The Economic Crimes Task Force, true to their word, managed to formally unfreeze and return the $340,000, transferring it securely back into the newly established Ironclad Trust. With the financial foundation fully restored, I was able to hire the absolute best, round-the-clock specialized memory care nurses for my wife. One evening, I sat in my armchair by the living room fireplace, watching the flames crackle and dance, holding a warm mug of black coffee. My wife was resting comfortably across from me, a thick hand-knitted blanket draped over her legs, a soft, contented smile on her fragile face. She didn't know about the betrayal, the federal raid, or the cold, structural, legal retribution that had taken place right at our dining table. She only knew that she was safe, warm, and deeply loved. I looked down at my hands. The heavy callouses, the deep scars, the permanent grease stains. They were the proud hands of a man who had spent a lifetime acting as a silent, load-bearing structure. Society often pushes the dangerous narrative that unconditional love means unconditional access, that you must allow toxic, greedy people to endlessly drain your resources simply because they share your blood. But I know better. True love and true protection of the innocent requires the courage to enforce rigid, unapologetic boundaries. I didn't ruin my son's life. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed the absolute crushing weight of his own arrogant actions to fall squarely on his shoulders, ensuring the perfect execution of morality and natural consequences. Because in the end, as I sat in the quiet warmth of my protected home, I knew the absolute truth. Revenge is loud, messy, and fueled by temporary rage. But justice? Justice is quiet, cold, and fundamentally unbreakable.